We've been in the middle of them, and very passionate they are too, although a number of them seem to be made up of off-duty members of the security forces. No doubting that a lot of people really appreciate it. It's extremely windy here. I hope you can hear me over the noise of the wind here. We're right on the Mediterranean coast where I am, but they appreciate the stability that the Colonel Gaddafi has brought to the country. But it goes beyond that, really. This is a country that has been of fear for many years. People have spoken to us privately about how unhappy they are with the situation here, but they would never go public with that, because to do that is to bring down the wrath of the security services on your family. So it's not something people dare to do. I was talking to some young Egyptians this evening, and I said to the difference between where Egypt was at and where Libya was at when the protests, when the clamor for greater freedoms began. And they said, well, in Egypt we were always able to speak our minds. We could criticize the president if we wanted to. We could complain. We could moan. We just couldn't join organizations or be active in opposition political life. Here in Libya, you can't even speak your mind.
Is any of the diplomatic activity evident in Tripoli? I wonder whether you've had a chance to find out whether those living there have been watching or had any chance to know about NATO's conference today. It didn't come up with anything, but it did say this isn't a civil war, this is an armed uprising, and NATO wants to concentrate on humanitarian surveillance and monitoring for the moment. And France, of course, as well, declaring its hand and acknowledging the opposition.
Well, indeed, the Red Cross is calling it a civil war. But when you ask me what the Tripoli think, you have to understand this is a city that hasn't had internet for the nearly the last 5 days, perhaps more. It's a city where the principal sources of information are all state-controlled. So what the people of Tripoli actually understand is quite hard to establish. The government is aware of these diplomatic maneuvers, and they're contemptuous of them. You heard Gaddafi talk about how the Europeans, in particular the French, needed to come over here and see how the people of Libya felt. But the world government here is that they are dealing with not a civil war, but a quite unjustified uprising among a small minority in their population that is sponsored by outside powers, egged on by the Arabic media, and fed also by the ideologues of Al-Qaeda. And they feel a sense of enormous grievance that they have been treated unfairly. For example, that their representatives, international bodies like the United Nations and the Arab League, have still continued to be heard, even though, as far as they're concerned, they're now campaigning against the legitimate government of Libya and have lost their mandate. The foreign minister made these points to me very strongly when I interviewed him yesterday. Here carrying on really as if nothing was unusual other than a little local difficulty with a few troublemakers at home.
All right, Anita, we'll leave it there before you're blown away on to the Libyan coast. Thanks very much for joining us. France, as Anita and I were talking about, has officially recognised the National Council, the alternative government set up by the Libyan opposition, and has severed ties with Muammar Gaddafi's regime. In the last few hours, NATO decided to send warships to the Mediterranean just off the coast of Libya, or a little closer at least to the coast of Libya. In a moment, we'll hear from Alan Fisher in Brussels at that meeting, but first this from Tim Friend in Paris.
After being accused of being slow to react to the revolutions in Tunisia and Egypt, the French president has moved quickly to silence his critics and take the lead in reprisals against Colonel Gaddafi. Meeting representatives of the rebels at the Elysee Palace, he promised them immediate diplomatic recognition.
France has expressed its satisfaction about the creation of the Libyan National Transition Council. And after this meeting with President Sarkozy, I can say that France has recognised the Transitional National Council as the legitimate representation of the Libyan people.
The French plan is reported to include proposing limited airstrikes against key Gaddafi targets, such as his headquarters and a military airbase. There was no official confirmation from President Sarkozy's office, and it's a highly controversial proposal that would meet with strong resistance from many European allies, who are also wary of giving the rebel representatives diplomatic recognition at this stage.
That's a decision by a single government. I think it's better for us to listen to the stance of the entire European community.
The Élysée Palace says that Mr. Sarkozy is seeking legal authority to prevent the use of force by Gaddafi. It believes that jamming his communications would be a good start. Tim Friend, Al Jazeera, Paris.
NATO is not about to go it alone. Call from member nations for a no-fly zone in Libya have been getting louder, but the organisation's Secretary-General says three principles must be met before NATO can take action.
Firstly, there has to be demonstrable need for NATO action. Secondly, there has to be a clear legal basis. And thirdly, there has to be firm regional support.
The Americans want a United Nations resolution. The Russians want details of how a no-fly zone would work. Others just want some information.
It's always a difficult subject. I'm waiting to hear what will be said today. I don't have any preconceived ideas.
NATO would take the lead in any action to cripple Colonel Gaddafi's air defences and air force. But NATO and European politicians want support from the African Union and other Middle East countries, because the last thing they want is this to be seen as Western military action against an Arab nation.
We do not want to get sucked into a war in North Africa. We want to have freedom, we want to support peace, and therefore we have to decide careful and wise. And this means we always should think about the end of the development which starts now.
Military experts say they could have a no-fly zone above Libya up and running in 2 to 3 days. The politicians are the ones who first have to give the green light.
The US Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton, says her government has been reaching out to Libyan groups seeking to oust Muammar Gaddafi from power. Hillary Clinton said she'll meet Libyan opposition groups both in Washington and when she goes to Egypt and Tunisia next week.
And we are standing with the Libyan people as they brave bombs and bullets to demand that Gaddafi must go now without further violence or delay. Our diplomats are hard at work with our allies and partners, including in the United Nations, NATO, the African Union, the Arab League, the Gulf Cooperation Council, to isolate, sanction, and pressure Gaddafi to stop the violence against his own people, and to send a clear message to those around Gaddafi who continue to enable this horrific attack on his own people, that they too will be held accountable if they commit crimes against the Libyan people.
We're hearing more reports from the Associated Press and Reuters that Saudi Arabian police have opened fire at a rally in the east of Saudi Arabia. And that shooting comes after the government warned it wouldn't tolerate any protests. Now, this is video. It was uploaded to a social media site before the incident and appears to show a group of mainly Shia Saudis gathered in the eastern city of Qatif on Wednesday night. They are calling for political reform in the kingdom and for the release of political prisoners. Recently, the Saudi government gave $36 billion